Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today we're making a marble box so that I don't lose my marbles anymore. Let's dive in. Today we're not going to be starting with white oak. We're actually going to be starting with pine shims. Okay, yeah, I'm trying to figure out how to make a box for marbles. How big does this box need to be? So I set out all the marbles I need on a square and figured, we'll make a square box. Maybe I'll make it 2 marbles deep. Maybe I'll make it 3 marbles deep. And I thought, wait a second. The board is a hexagonal shape, so why don't I make a hexagonal box? I haven't made one of those in a while, and they're kind of fun. So let's put together 6 shims here and see where they come out. Needs to be 120 degrees per side, and theoretically that should make it out. And I just have to figure out how many marbles along one side, and then that lets me know how long to make each side. This actually took a little bit longer than it should have, because it was one of those things where I was like, one way and then another, and then back to the other way, and how big is a marble, and I should be able to multiply it, but it's not actually by the outside of them, and it was kind of an interesting thought process. I ended up actually just laying them out and figuring out and measuring the actual size it would be. So for the actual box, we're going to be making that out of white oak. Yeah, I couldn't go without that. And I'm cutting the strips down to about 1/4 inch. Originally, I was planning on putting magnets in it, and I thought, oh yeah, 1/4 inch, I can put the smaller magnets in, but the smallest magnet I had on hand was 1/4 inch. So I wish I would have made these walls a little bit bigger, but oh well, such is life. It's going to be 3/4 inch thick to start with, and then we are going to rip it down. And we are going to just rip it. Yeah, this is one of those things that kind of scares some people, but if you get okay at it and you practice your saw work and you keep your arm in line with the saw, you can make nice clean works. So we've got this strip that is 3/4 inch by a little over 1/4 inch, and I need to then plane it down. And I need a little bit extra space, so I put a wedge in there and then broke it off, because from point to point, it was just a hair shorter than it could be to fit in between those. So we're just going to plane it until we get down to our marks and make it an even thickness, because we had those marking gauge marks left on there when we sawed it to it, and our saw stayed just a hair away from it. And on this one, of course, the grain goes opposite directions, and so I have to plane half of it one direction and half of it the other direction. Also, I am going to rip this down a little bit farther because I don't want it to be 3/4 inch tall. I want it to be just a little taller than the marble. So I'm going to put a marking gauge line on there, and this one I can just put in the vise and plane it down. I'm only taking off 1/8 inch or so, so it's not worth grabbing the saw to try and weasel 1/8 inch off. A few passes with the plane and we get it down to the height we're looking for. So this thing gives us our sidewall pieces, and we need to actually cut angles on the end of it. The angles need to be 120 degrees or 60 degrees if you're measuring from the other side. So I use my protractor, set up a bevel gauge on there, and with this one I actually want to create a slot in it so I can just quickly cut it. So I've got my bench hook here, and in the back of the bench hook I'm just going to put a slot at 120 degrees or 60 degrees, however you want to measure it, which direction. So I'll put a vertical mark on there, and I'll just make sure I cut vertically right on that line I drew across the top. And that gives me my slot that is exactly the angle I want. And so now I don't have to think about it or mark them. I can just put the stick in there and cut it off. For the first one, we're just going to cut on the end and lay it out. And so this will give us a one end that is close to where we want it. It's not exact, but it's very close. I can measure out the length I need with the calipers that I measured earlier, and I can put a stop mark on the other side of the board and cut it to match. Now, initially I was planning on having the arms overlap each other so that they wouldn't all be a miter, but the ends would overlap. However, my brain kind of farted in the measurement and length and how they actually work out. And yeah, they should have been a parallelogram, but they should have been a trapezoid, but it ended up being I needed a parallelogram, and then sticks weren't long enough, and so, well, we made a mistake. So we're going to recut all of these into a rhombus, or whatever that shape is. One side is smaller than the other. Yeah, someone will tell me in the comments. Thankfully, they were just long enough for that, and so now every corner is actually going to have a miter joint. There really isn't going to be any force on this, so the miter joint doesn't have to be very strong, and they're going to be held together with the bottom anyways. So in this case, they don't have to be anything special. We can just make the ends butt up. I had thought about putting splines in there, but I decided to go against it. So to put all these in place and hold them together, I could have used rubber bands, but I actually found that using zip ties was a little bit easier, because then I can zip tie them close to where they want, and I can take it on and off easily, and each time they come back in. Now we can fit the marbles in and see, they're just a little bit sloppy. Oh wait, I have slots. That means one marble's rolling around on the floor somewhere. I wonder where it went. So I need to make these slightly smaller, ever so slightly smaller. And so I thought I could just cut one down and get it close, but I wasn't really liking that. So what I did is got the shooting board out, and I remembered that I have this set up so I can put it at an angle. So I have this set up to a 60-degree angle, and then I could just shoot the ends of it. And that worked out great. And I wish I had thought about that from the beginning and just gone and shot them all rather than cutting them all. And that would have made life a lot easier. But in the end, oh well, you live, you learn. You hopefully actually do learn from that. And so now we can put the marbles in there and find that, yeah, it's exactly what I want. And there will be one empty slot in this because for the amount of marbles you need, that's what I want. This is still a little loose, so I'm going to take them back and shoot it 2 or 3 more times until I get it right where I want it. And I want the marbles to be tight. I want them to shake just a tiny bit, but I want them to actually have to push down in there to get the last one in. And I'm actually really happy with the fit I got. As long as I went back and forth and tried it until I got them where I wanted it, that's what I'm looking for right there. That's right about where I want it. So now that we have all of these sides exactly the way they need to be, we need to have a top and bottom for the box. I have another piece of white oak scrap that I have, and I'm just going to cut it square, a little bit larger than it needs to be. And then we're going to resaw this, and we're going to have the top come out of one half and the bottom come out of the other half. That way there's a matching grain on there, and they're both quarter sawn, so it just looks good. To do the resawing, I'm not going to rip the end, cut the end off of it. I'm going to rip it first and then cross-cut it. You also notice I'm making one of these bigger than the other one. The bottom is going to glue straight onto the sidewalls. The top lid, I want to recess into the box a little ways, and so I need that to be a little thicker so that when the lid is on, the top and bottom look like they're the same thickness. So we get to pull out the frame saw and rip it down and then cross-cut it, and we've got 2 pieces out of 1 board. And this is happy. It's kind of fun when you can play with things and get out of the scrap what you would want. And never throw away your scrap. You're always going to need it. So we're going to epoxy these on. Why epoxy? Because epoxy doesn't need a lot of clamping strength, and it goes on really well, and it fills in gaps. It's just got all the little things you need that PVA or hide glue just won't do in this simple application. Plus, we're going to be gluing them on semi-cross grain. I know it's not going to make as much in this size, but epoxy is just going to give me the more that I'm looking for. And the nice thing is I don't need to seriously clamp them in place like I would need with a PVA. I can just use a few spring clamps and put them in. And then I'm going to set the marbles down in here and make sure that it is actually the right size, because I'm not actually going to square this to anything particular. I just want the marbles to be able to fit in there. And so as long as I push them down in, they will conform the size and shape that it needs to be. And I know that this will be correct when it dries. So we'll set this aside and then come back once it's cured and make a lid for it. So we'll set it aside, and we ended up leaving it for 2 weeks until the project came back. Now we need to get the marbles out, and I couldn't figure out a way of good dumping it, so I just put a case over it that covered them all and flipped them all. And I didn't lose any of them. I was really happy. None of them ended up on the floor. That was kind of one of those, wow, it actually worked. Take the clamps off, and now we need to trim up the bottom to match the sides. I had originally thought of making the bottom stick out a little bit farther, but after seeing it, I thought, I'm just actually going to trim it up. So I put it in the vise, and we start cutting down. This is thin stock, and for thin stock like this, sometimes I'm going to use the Japanese saw. Sometimes I'll use the back saw. And in this one, most of them I did with the back saw because it was deep enough. The big nice thing about the Japanese saw is it doesn't have a back on it, so you can actually go in a little farther. It's a little slower, but it has its benefits. So sometimes you one, sometimes you use the other. Just getting them close. I'm not worrying about taking anything off. We're going to then come back and plane them back down. Now you have to be careful when planing them back down, because on the other side, you're going to hit that miter joint and it's going to rip out the fibers. So you want to stop just shy of going all the way down to it. And we're going to then clean it up a little bit later, but we're just getting it close to its side. And from this point on, everything is being done 6 times. Every process needs to be done 6 times. We trim up all sides 6 times. We lay it down on the bench, and then we mark it off 6 times. And it's one of these things where it seems like it gets a little monotonous, but every step actually goes pretty quickly. We're going to mark it off and then saw back close to the lines. I want to keep it away from it because I'm going to keep the lid a little bit oversized until we get it right down to where we want it to be. But the lines will give us a really close indication. Then we'll come back and I'm going to plane it back almost to the line and just barely kiss it. I don't want to really go into the line. I just want to sit there until the line right about there. You can still see it. Then we're going to set it on the box, and this will let us know which sides we need to take a little more off and not take off on the other side, because I want it to be exactly up to it. And in this case, for the most part, I can clamp it in the vise and then just plane the whole face all at once and make sure that the box lid is true to the box sides. Now I need to make a recess, a rabbet running around the inside of the lid so that it will fit down on. To get an accurate measurement, I'm going to use my marking gauge and set it up to the thickness of the wall. And I can put this on there, and that way when I mark a rabbet around the inside, I know I'm going in the appropriate amount. And I'm actually going to make it ever so slightly smaller than it is because I can always take off a little bit more. You may have heard that before. You're probably going to hear it again. Always stay away from it and then sneak up on it when you really want a nice tight fit. I'm only going to be cutting in about an 1/8 inch or so. I don't need it to go down in very far. I just need it to go in a little bit. And so we can then mark the marking gauge around the perimeter this way and know how far in we need to cut. And for this one, it makes it really easy. I'm just going to go right into that knife wall. I don't need it to be terribly close. I'm not taking off a lot, and I'm going back to that saw cut, so it will split off very nicely. And in this case, it came off just a little bit deeper, and we can come back in, set it down a little bit more, and then chop it out. And then every time I'm going to then come in with the chisel and clean up all those little bits and furs that stick up. The chisel is the last thing to touch each of the rabbet joints. And this looks tedious, but it is incredibly fun. I don't know why, but anytime you're using a chisel to do stock removal, it's a fun time. And so you can chop in from the outside and then chop down on the back and get yourself a nice, clean, tight corner. Now, sure shooting, this is not going to fit the first time right off of the saw. And so I'm going to put it on there and see where I need to adjust it. And then in some of these, I'm going to come back in and take off a little bit more. And I left them with a lot more wiggle room than I needed. I also cut the rabbet a little bit deeper than I needed because I can always plane off the inside. I want this the lid to push down on top of the marbles and actually be flat on there. For some of these, I experimented with bringing in the shoulder plane. However, there wasn't a lot of material for it to register on, so I found that to be a bit of a pain. And it got really close, and then I'd come back in and shave off a little bit more. And it got really, really, really close, and then I'd come back in and shave off a little bit more until I got that nice tight fit where it just kind of popped down on there and was enough to friction hold itself on. And that's what I wanted. The other thing I did is put all the marbles into the body, and then I could put the lid on it and make sure that the lid went all the way down and touched the marble, and the rabbet actually touched the rim all the way around it. So I'd push it on and see how much more it needs to actually go on, and then plane the bottom of the lid down just a little bit more until I get a nice tight joint. And again, you're just sneaking up on the line and getting close to it until you actually hit it. It's very, very easy to take a lot off, and it's very, very hard to put it back on. At this point, it's done. We're just going to do a lot of the last little detail finishing work. I need to smooth off the top, and I actually want to take the top now down to the same thickness as what is on the bottom, so that when the lid goes on, the two of them look they're about the same thickness. And then we're going to chamfer everything. Put a chamfer all the way around on the bottom, put a chamfer all the way around on the top. And at this point, I thought I'd be done, but then I looked at it again. I thought, the top of this box is kind of bland, and you've got the grain running on the inside and the end grain on it, and it needs something a little bit more. And I haven't done carving on this in a while, and we're putting this on for a Chinese checkers box. So let's put a 6-pointed star on the top of this and see how that looks. And the nice thing about this is you just mark a line corner to corner on every other corner, and you've got a star on there. It's one of the beautiful things about a hexagon is play dot to dot and then come in and chisel it out. And so a chisel and a mallet with a fine little V tool, and it comes right along. And I just run one of those lines right along one side of it, and it cuts out. I started off with the mallet, which is what I usually use, but for curves, it works great. For straight lines, I generally prefer to just use the stabbing motion and rub it in. Then, of course, when we put on the boiled linseed oil and paste wax, the white oak grain just pops. Makes me so happy. Soak it all in, let it take up as much as it wants, and then wipe off the excess, apply the paste wax, and that's that. The box is done. I had looked at magnets and other things, but in this case, I'm just going to leave it like that. So let's make sure that all the marbles fit as they're supposed to, and make sure the lid goes on as it is supposed to, because, well, the best laid plans of any woodworker, yeah, there's problems. And the one downside to this is it only goes on one way. Each side is ever so slightly different, but I really like how this came out. It's a nice little tight box and actually works really well. Rather kind of happy. I like it. Simple project, only took a couple hours, and we've got a box. And it makes me very, very happy. So there you have it, a simple little box. This will go with the Chinese checkers board that we made a couple weeks ago. And I like this one, especially with having a place for the marbles to go. I originally thought I would drill holes into the side of the board to store marbles in the board. And I like this one, although I might put some magnets in here to hold it onto the board. On that line, I was originally thinking about putting magnets to hold the top onto this, but I made the sidewalls just a little too thin to get the magnets in there. So I'm still thinking through how I want to do that, but actually it holds pretty well even without that. So I'm really happy with how this came out. It is a nice, simple little box, and making something that's not square is actually kind of surprisingly fun. So get out of the box. Make something different. And I hope you like this. If you have any questions, thoughts, ideas, snide remarks, throw those down in the comments down below, as well as just hitting simply comment down below. All of that helps out the channel. Thank you. Without you guys hitting like, share, subscribe, commenting, no one would find us on YouTube, because the algorithm loves that stuff. So thank you for doing that. And if you want to take it even farther, think about becoming a patron on Patreon. We are completely sponsored by you guys. Without you and members here on the channel, we wouldn't exist. We are completely sponsored by viewers. So if you'd like to find out more about that and help us out, we have special perks for both, and you know where to find all the information down below. I think that'll do it for now. And until next time, have a wonderful day. Is a hexagonal box really thinking outside of the box if you're making it a box?